Thank you guys so much for being here tonight. My name is Emma Neely. I am the Education and Events Intern for Cutoff Studios. And on behalf of Cutoff Studios, we want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to throw it over to Bryce to just kind of give a brief summary of what we do here at Cutoff Studios, and then I'll introduce our speaker for today. Bryce?
Yeah, hello. Thank you all for being here. Cutoff Studios is a full service a cappella company. We do everything from production that we're going to talk about today to arranging, consulting, educational events, community events. So we've been around since 2014. We're entirely composed of folks passionate about a cappella. Um, most of us have full-time jobs in addition to our work with the studio, so it's a really wonderful way for us to continue to be involved with such a great community. And events like tonight's first Taste Acapella Zoom call are just one of the ways in which Cutoff can help you and your group. If you want to learn more, you can go to cutoffstudios.com. But we're really excited to have everyone here this evening, and I'll kick it over to our speaker for the evening, Kyle, who oversees all of our production activities at Cutoff. So, Kyle, take it away.
Hey everybody, what's going on?
Recording
my
in
name's
progress.
Uh, my name's Kyle. I've been doing audio production for the studio for about 8 years. I graduated from undergrad in 2016 and kind of jumped right into audio production, mostly self-taught. It is something that you can teach yourself, and I think that um, at the end of the day, no one can really teach you to hear certain things. You have to sit down and listen to things a lot over and over to figure out how your ears work and basically what you think sounds good. Um, so without blabbing too much about ourselves, uh, I see that we've got Michael, we've got Nicholas, and we've got Esme on the phone. Is there or on the call? Is there anyone else that I'm missing? I can see 9 people in total. So we might get some more people trickle in throughout the end of throughout the call, but before I go blabbing about audio production, if you all could post in the chat, you can come off mute. If you could tell us something, maybe where you're in school, where you're from, what you're looking to get out of this, kind of this informational session. I could blab on about pretty much anything in audio production, but it will be more meaningful if I learn what you care the most about. So before I go on, does anyone have any questions, anything you want to share?
Uh, I can introduce myself. So my name is Esme Pelton. I am a sophomore studying choral music education at University of Illinois. Also the music director of of Off the Record, which is the co-ed non-competitive group on campus. And we are currently developing ideas for maybe an EP or an album. And I have experience in audio production and specifically vocal mixing. But I came here because I know it's a great resource for a cappella. And yeah.
Thank you, Esme. Nicholas or Michael, either of you want to speak up or at least kind of tell us maybe one thing you're hoping to get out of this class?
Uh, Hello everyone. This is Nicholas, and I don't think you can tell from the camera view here, but or maybe from like the way I'm dressed, like it's actually like all the way in the morning. It's 6 in the morning right now because I'm all the way from Hong Kong, so I just crawled out of bed to join your Zoom meeting. So I'm also a I'm actually to be like a graduate to be like from a university in Hong Kong studying Earth System Science, which is like totally different from anything related to music. But in recent years, I've been like dabbling slightly in music production, particularly a cappella, and I just came off randomly, just came across this post on Facebook saying, "Oh, there's uh, a Zoom like this kind of setting it like for acapella, understanding more about acapella from Cutoff Studio, and it just so happens that I'm recently like making my first ever acapella project, and in the process, like I'm recording and like trying to mix some of the tracks, and like it's really getting on me that there are like, so many things to learn about mixing that I just don't know about them. And I'm not sure if I'm able to ask questions later on because there's just so many questions in my head that I'm not even sure where to begin. But I'm just glad to join the meeting today.
We encourage that you ask questions, especially because there are so few of you here. You know, again, I could talk about things that maybe you don't need to know, or things that kind of just like things that I think are important, but it makes me feel better if I'm talking to an audience that cares. So, Nicholas, you know, without going crazy into your list, what is one or two things that are top of mind that you want to talk about, or you want us to talk about?
Mm. These days I'm messing around with the reverb settings of like the tracks, and
Mhm.
it seems that I want to get a sound with like a bigger reverb, but when you have like 10 to 20 tracks of using a reverb with such a large size, it just everything gets kind of muffled, and I'm not sure how to like tweak the little buttons. I
Yep.
think that's the
So I'm not
first
gonna,
thing.
yeah, that's good. I'll answer that not right away because we'll get a little bit into it, but I'll probably get there in like 20 minutes. All right.
Yeah, sure.
Esme, do you have anything at the top of your mind?
Oh gosh. I think more just like mastering. If you have any tips for mastering, that's something that's
Sure.
been on my mind recently.
Have you done mixes before? Like, have you done like mixes start to
Mhm.
finish? Okay. And have
Yeah,
you done any?
I have.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, basically, yes. Yes, I have. But I'm always looking for more tips. And also I've done mixes that are like mostly myself and with like but I've never mixed something that's like our group is 17 people. I've never actually mixed 17 different voices before. And mastering is also something that I find more challenging. So.
Okay. So I'll, well, so this is good. It sounds like you both have experience, so I don't need to like, you know, baby step our way into this. So, um, the first thing I want to like let you all know about is, you know, the most important part of the process, right? So if we think of music production as, you know, the start of the process is us writing the song to us mastering and uploading our song to Spotify, right? The the first part of the process, right, is writing your song and your arrangement. Um, if you have a great singer, right? You have a world-class singer and a wonderful microphone, but you give them some really bad content to sing or something that just doesn't sound good for their voice, it's not going to sound good, right? And so what I like to tell people, and a lot of time when I go to work with groups, they say, you know, what can we do to get better? And one of the things that they can do to get better is they can do arrangements that are fit for the human voice better. So I like to kind of ease people into this and let them understand that your arrangement and your quality of your singers are like the thing that's going to help you the most, right? You know, I've done over 100 mixes now, right? And like, what's the thing that's not like, oh, this one technique I use in mixing, or this one editing tool I use, or this one plugin I have? All those things make a little bit of a difference, but the thing that makes the biggest difference is the song you're singing and the singers you are recording, right? So like working our way macro, like that's the biggest thing. After that, the next thing that makes the biggest difference is the microphone that you use and the physical space that you record in, right? So if you've gotten, you know, if you're telling yourself, hey, I've got a great arrangement, I've got some good singers, I've got a decent quality microphone, right? I'm not plugging some, you know, $20 USB microphone into my laptop and, you know, recording in someone's kitchen. So if you've taken care of all of that And then it takes a lot of their other issues out of the way and makes things like editing and mixing a lot easier, because you're not trying to, make a project that might not be that great in the end, some masterpiece that you're comparing it to, right? So after you've gotten all that down, a large portion, I usually say about 1/3 of the process for the production, is editing, right? And so when I say editing, what do I really mean? I'm talking about taking what you've recorded and putting it more in time, in tempo, and on pitch, right? Making sure that when I play back this mix, there's nothing I hear where I say, oh, that came in a little bit too early, that came in a little bit too late, this cut off too early, this is running on too long, these two parts are fighting rhythmically. So a lot of those things are not really mixing, at least what I refer to as mixing. So if you're telling yourself, hey, like something's not right with this, before you go and reach into your reverb settings, or you think, oh, mastering will fix this, check yourself and say, hey, maybe this is just flat. Maybe this is just sharp. Maybe this is an audio file that needs to be repaired. Maybe there's too much noise in the file, right? So those are all things that I don't really consider mixing, right? So like when and a couple of people on this call, Ian and Mitch, have both been through our internship. And I always tell them, like, if you can basically get to a point where your project has been well recorded, good arrangement, and you've gotten the editing, you've gotten all the content down and nicely balanced before you use any plugin, it's going to make your life so much easier, because in mixing, you won't feel the need to have to do as much to get the song to where you want it to be. But let's dive into a session that I have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste a link. So I have pasted a link in the chat. This is a link to a website called Audio Movers. So fun fact, if you don't have a Mac and you don't use what's called the Zoom audio drivers, most of the time when you share audio over Zoom, it's going to degrade the audio. And so what I want you all to do is open this link, and you're going to hit start streaming or start listening. And what it's going to do is it's going to basically stream audio from my Pro Tools session right to your headphones. You should be able to hear it. And I'm going to share my screen in a second here. Okay. All right. And there's no one else that's joined the call, right? Cool. Sure. All right. So here's my screen. Everyone can see my screen? All right. Esme and Nicholas, I'm going to play something. If you just give me a thumbs up when you can hear it. You cannot hear that audio. Nicholas has it on his end. So Esme, did you you opened the link that I posted in the Zoom chat, right? And you hit start listening on there, or start streaming. Just go ahead, close down that link and open it up again. There's not too many ways to troubleshoot this. I can slow down the stream a little bit, but I don't know if that'll help. You give me a thumbs up when you want me to give it a try here, okay? Yikes. I don't know. Esme, are you listening back to music via an interface or via like your headphones plugged right into your laptop?
Yeah, it's just my headphones plugged into the laptop. So I'm trying to.
Okay. Let me try something. Hold on. I'm going to slow this down.
Sorry.
That's okay. And you open up a different link on your laptop and just open up like YouTube and see if you can play a YouTube video and if it just plays back. And if you can hear like anything else outside of Zoom. You can. Okay. Cool. And you still have that link open. All right. See if you can hear this.
Not, but it says there's a stream on this link, or a stream has not started yet.
Okay, let's try this then. I'm gonna stop streaming, and I'm gonna start streaming again, and I'm gonna copy a new stream link. All right, let's do this. All right, here's a new stream link. It might be the same exact link. You all give me a thumbs up when you've got that link open and you hit start streaming. You might have to like allow, your browser might ask you to allow something too. Right, I'm gonna play this here. You give me a thumbs up if you got audio. All right, you got it? Cool. All right, so let's just listen to a little bit of this song. This song is called Lights Up. It's by Harry Styles. This is by a co-ed collegiate a cappella group. All right, so I'm gonna start by just addressing some of both of your questions. So, Nicholas, I'm gonna start with your question on reverb. So, when I think of a reverb, first thing I think of when I use reverb is I cut low end frequency the majority of the time. So, why do I cut low frequencies from reverb? Because low frequencies, whether it's a bass, whether it's a kick drum, it carries more amplitude. The lower frequencies sustain more. They travel farther. And because of this, when you feed low end into a reverb, it tends to really dominate the signal. And so I'm going to show you an example of a reverb plugin that I have on, let's say, so this is a plugin called Seventh Heaven, right? It's just a reverb plugin. But a lot of the reverb plugins, I think that the good ones have an EQ and they have filters built into them, right? So this right here is a reverb that's going to my drums. And I'm cutting everything below 225 hertz on this. I'm also cutting everything above 4,000 hertz on this, 4.12 kilohertz. You know, those numbers are not things that like, oh, I got to memorize that, you know, but there is something that is called the Abbey Road curve. It's just a nickname for a technique to use. Most of the time, when I pull up a reverb plugin, what I'll do is I will put an EQ plugin directly before or directly after that. Most of the time, I'll put it afterwards. And what I'll do is I'll cut everything below 600 hertz and everything above 10 kilohertz or 10,000 hertz. And then these are not magic numbers, right? This is just a place to start, right? So a lot of times when you hear reverb, it does not happen really a lot below like 200, 300 hertz. A lot of times you're hearing the reverb anywhere from 400 hertz to like 5,000 hertz. You're hearing in like the mids and upper mids and the high end. And so something else that I typically do, if you think about processing a vocal and what we call a vocal chain, right? I've got, you know, one vocal and I'm going to put a bunch of plugins on. I'm going to put a compressor on it, an EQ, blah, blah, blah. I tend to not put my reverb plugin directly onto a track, right? So here is the solo track right here. I actually do have a reverb plugin on here, but it's because I'm automating it. We'll get into that in a sec. But when I use reverbs, I like to use them as spices in a way. And I set up what's called an auxiliary track. Okay, so auxiliary tracks are different than audio tracks. Audio tracks are files, are tracks in your session that have literal audio files on them. An auxiliary track, or also known as a bus, is a place where you can send a copy of an audio file to. So I would have this file right here going to my master bus, and then if I wanted to send a copy of this file, which they call a send, I would choose a fader here and I would say, hey, I want to send a copy of it to this auxiliary track. And the thing that's nice is that I can send that to another track, and I'll usually put reverb on that, but then I can do different things to that reverb track, right? So I've got my vocal that's kind of the exact way I want it, and then I can send it to a reverb where I have the freedom to EQ just the reverb, right? It's hard sometimes to EQ just the reverb, especially if you're using what are called stock plugins. Stock plugins are just plugins that come with your digital audio workstation. And sometimes they don't have the convenient features of a low frequency cut and a high frequency cut built into them. And you need to do those things manually before or after the reverb. And so one way you can get a lot of control on that is you can send them to an auxiliary track, and you might have a little bit more control over that. Something else I do, to example, like the solo reverb. A lot of the time when we hear reverb and we really like reverb, we hear it the most when someone is not singing, right? And so what I like to do is I like to automate my reverb, right? So what am I going to do? And I did it a little bit here, is basically in moments where the person's gonna sing and then they let go and they stop singing. Right when they stop singing, you want to turn up the reverb just a little bit there. And you can do this by just kind of like riding the fader and say, okay, turn up here, turn down here, turn up here, turn down here. That's called automation, right? You're setting the fader to automatically do something. The other way you can do this is if you put a reverb on, you can then put a compressor on that reverb. And what's the compressor going to do? If you set it appropriately, when the vocal comes in, and you have vocal with reverb coming in, it's going to turn down when it gets loud. The compressor is going to turn things down above a certain threshold, and then when the compressor stops singing and stops getting triggered, it's going to let go, right? So those are some things that you can do to use reverb more as a background ambience instead of saying like, oh, I put reverb, And then there's the concept like not everything needs reverb. The more reverb you give something, the further away it's going to sound. The less reverb you give something, the closer it's going to sound. So a lot of mixing is creating contrast between different elements. Okay. So Nicholas, does that give you a little bit of insight on how I use reverb?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been taught to use the auxiliary tracks, but I just as you said, I simply followed formulas on YouTube, and I'm not sure what they meant, and you just explained it very well.
Yeah, it's a place where you can send a copy of audio, and then you can affect it like independently, right? And sometimes the thing that's nice too, like if you wanna, let's say I've got 20 background vocals, right? You say, well, I really only want to put a lot of reverb on the sopranos, but only a little bit on the tenors. Well, you can send more, like you can send a louder level of signal from the sopranos end and then turn down the tenors a little bit. And like you can send less of the tenors and more of the sopranos, and you have the freedom to do that. So yeah. All right, Esme. So if you look really closely here, I'm gonna go extreme size. This is right now, this is the mastering chain I have on here, right? And this is gonna look absolutely insane. I'm gonna put all this up. In Pro Tools, if you hold down Shift, you can pull up multiple plugins at once, like just on your screen visually. Let's hide that. Okay. Right. But I'll show you the most important plugin. So there's about 10 plugins running, and we're going to play and just watch some of these, and just so you can see, you know, I'm not going to talk about each one, but I'll kind of more so overall talk about everything. So when I sit down and I open up a mix, there's a lot of different opinions about how to do this. But what I think most people should be doing is you should set up a little bit, again, we're going to assume that you've done a really good job editing. You've done a good job with like kind of automating your mix a little bit first, right? You know, don't wait until you get to the mixing stage to say like, oh, the group needs to get really loud here, right? Take your time. It's the editing stage. Like when you play back your mix from not using any plugins, you should be able to play it and say, yeah, this kind of almost gets to where I want it to dynamically, right? It gets a little bit quieter, gets a little bit louder, and it should sound good already. And so at that point, I set up a little bit of a mastering chain. And in the mastering chain, it's usually a combination of EQ, compression, and limiting. And something that I really focus on when I'm mastering my own music, which I don't do that often, I honestly like to send to a mastering engineer, is you pay attention to the loudness of it, right? So the last plugin in your chain should be a limiter, typically. And what is a limiter? A limiter is a brick wall compressor. So like this is an example of a really easy to just understand limiter. I'm going to make this bigger, that way we can see it. All right, I'm going to play the song and you'll see what's going on. So these red spikes here, these negative red spikes, what's happening is the kick is hitting that and then it's being turned down, right? And so limiting is saying, hey, your music will not pass this point, literally, right? And so it's helpful to set your limiter, you know, somewhat safely and set a really easygoing compressor. You know, the compressor setting I have here is a super slow attack, a super fast release, and a nice low ratio. And what that really means, all that terminology, it means that I'm not going to get that much compression, right? I'll get like 1 or 2 decibels of compression. And the thing that's nice is that if you set that early and you kind of set it safely and you mix into it, right? You say, okay, I've got this set. I know this is kind of how this almost has to be. Now, with that already set, let's make our listening decisions going into this. The opposite of that is like, okay, I'm going to mix my entire song and then I'm going to put on some mastering processing, but maybe that mastering processing will sound weird because I didn't listen going into it, right? But the most important thing that I use on my mastering bus are these 2 plugins. One of them is what's called a LUFS meter. So if you haven't heard of a LUFS meter, LUFS right here, LUFS, it stands for loudness units full scale. And this is a little bit more of a subjective way to make decisions about how loud your song is, how in your face is like your literal audio file, your mix. So loudness units full scale basically measures the amount of decibels between the loudest point of your song and the quietest point of your song. So a super loud mix in your face the entire time is going to be like -6 LUFS. A super quiet song is going to be -14 LUFS. And what's kind of silly is that Spotify recommends -14 LUFS, but I just sent a message to our team a couple days ago that most of the pop songs of like 2024 that everyone loves, most of those songs were mastered at about -8 LUFS, much louder than Spotify recommends, right? So it's this kind of, you know, it's this subjective loudness more, but don't think of this as like overall, like the track is louder. Think of it as like the entire mix being like pressed into your face and like the mix being, you know, pressed into like a glass wall, Like the entire thing is just more in your face. It's closer. And so I'm going to play this right here and we'll see how loud this mix is.
What do you mean? I'm sorry, by the way. I'm never coming back down. Can't you see I could but wouldn't stay? Wouldn't put it like that. What do you mean?
So this mix is about 3 to 4 LUFS, loudness units, louder than Spotify recommends I print it. So shame on me, but you know, when you have a mix that's a little bit quieter, like -14 LUFS, what can happen is, you know, if you send this to a mastering engineer and they say, well, like, listen, I know this should be louder, they're gonna turn up the mix by compressing it more, by squeezing it a little bit. And you're going to end up hearing things that are really low level in your mix. So I like to kind of get my masters to a loud point. That way I know that there's nothing I'm missing. There's nothing that's going to sneak up if I send this to mastering that I haven't heard. I don't advocate people to buy a lot of plugins. There is one that I really like, and because Black Friday is coming up, I'll talk about it. This plugin, it's not necessary, but it makes my life easier. And this plugin's called Adapter. And what it allows me to do is it allows me to compare my song within my mix to other music, right? Like literally I click one switch and it flips to another song and I'll find out like, wow, my song sounds terrible compared to this. But hey, my song's actually pretty close. And, you know, maybe I can, I'll just use this right here. I'm just comparing like a real song here, but I'm going to play my mix and then I'll switch back and forth to another mix.
Like that, what? Like that, what do you mean? I'm sorry, by the way. I'm never coming around. I see you go, so show me if I'm gonna be honest. I wanna make a song that sounds like you, and baby, if you want it, you and I could leave it on a high note. Baby, we're so close. Heart lights up and they know who you are. Know who you are. Do you know who you are?
So this saves me from like stopping what I'm doing, pulling up Spotify. I don't know that Spotify is playing back the same volume I am. It takes a lot of like the technical bias out of the way, and I can literally click back and forth. So this is one tool I find that really helps me and keeps me honest. I reference music as I go back and forth, and I've gotten to the point now where I'm not looking for my mix to sound exactly like another mix, right? There are other sessions where I've pulled in like 7 different songs. I had like a Lil Wayne song, a John Mayer song, a Pentatonic song, a this song, a this song, a this song. And when you compare all of those mixes to each other, they all sound so different from one another. And it opens you up to this idea that like, it's okay that your song sounds a little different, right? I don't need my song to be exactly the same, but it shouldn't be like so different that you're like, like, how can I can't release this, it's to zoom out and not say, oh, I need to add 0.5 decibels at 100 hertz and then it'll be perfect. It's like, no, it's, are the drums loud enough? Are we comparing apples with apples? And so in the mastering process, don't be afraid to compress your mixes a little bit to get them up to a point where when you compare them, you can compare the loudness of the songs too, right? So you can say, oh, this song over here was mastered at -8 LUFS. Oh my gosh, like if I want to make my mix sound more like this, I probably need to compress it more, right? And so it helps you make decisions, and sometimes you pick a specific reference, say, hey, this song really matches this other song. I know this is like the closest target I can think of that I want to mix towards. You need to kind of be honest with those decisions. Also, when I listen to my songs and I say, hey, I really want to, do better on the master with this, don't do it at the end of the day. Do it in the morning. So I find that like when I wake up, and I haven't been listening to traffic, listening to other music, listening to all this stuff, haven't been mixing for 4 hours, I make better decisions. Like, I'll sit down and listen to my mix after mixing it. Like, if I mix today and I listen tomorrow I'll listen and be like, yep, I was wrong about that decision. That needs to get turned up. That needs to get turned down. I also like to mix on different systems, right? Recently, I've been mixing on Bluetooth headphones, believe it or not. And you might say that's absolutely crazy, but I listen to these headphones. I listen to music on these headphones all the time. Listen on the train. I listen at the gym. Because of that, I know these headphones really well. Are they the best, highest quality headphones? Absolutely not. But think about what system most of your listeners are listening back to music on. Probably AirPods. If you care that much about what your listeners are going to be listening to, get a pair of AirPods, you know. But what's important is that you take time and learn some monitoring system. Learn a set of speakers, learn a set of headphones, learn something really well, and then try to use that as your reference. It'll help you. It'll help you just get more familiar with studying small little changes. All right. That was a really long rant for 2 questions. What other questions do you have? Hopefully a lot of that was helpful. So if you don't ask questions, I'm pretty much just going to walk through this mix. Real fast, I do have a question. What type of microphone are both of you recording music? If you are recording music, what type of microphone are you using?
Oh, so I'm using this 80-20-50 condenser.
Excellent.
I haven't been doing, but I use condenser as well. It's similar to what he
Good.
has.
Cool. So you want to use a large diaphragm condenser microphone when you're recording in the studio setting, right? So those are microphones that are not meant to be held with your hand while you record. They sit in a shock mount in a basket type thing that looks like this. You can see this. And you want to use a pop filter, right? Something that prevents all the air. Good. Mitch is holding up a pop filter. Very nice. Very nice. That's going to help you get just good recordings. You know, the hardest part is finding an appropriate space to record in. How do you test the space? When you record someone, have them sing kind of loud, and then take their vocal and compress it. And when you add a compressor to it, it's going to turn down the loud parts and turn up the quiet parts. And you're going to hear, if you can hear a lot of the room attached to the tail end of the vocal, it's probably not a great room. But again, you have to work with what you can. You know, there are de-reverb and de-noise plugins that exist. They work a little bit. You know, sometimes they really suck the life out of your recording if you do too much. All right. So I'm going to talk about this mix that we've got in front of us. If you all have any questions, go ahead and speak up. All right. So let's cover the drums first. If you don't know it, I'm using Pro Tools. Okay, so these are all drum tracks. These are all drum tracks. All of these are drum tracks. So recorded studio a cappella is so far sonically from what is possible live. So if you're telling yourself, like, wow, how did they get all those drum sounds? They got them probably in isolation and then individually processed each sample. So this track right here is titled Kick because it's just the kick. The processing that goes on a kick drum is going to be different than the processing that goes on a hi-hat, that goes on a rim, that goes on a snare, that goes on everything. There's going to be layers upon layers upon layers of things going on. Let's see if we can just solo the drums. If I can find that track. Give me a moment here. So kind of referencing back to mastering, most of the time when I make decisions about, hey, how do I know that my drums are loud enough? I like to typically have my drums be technically speaking, the loudest thing in the mix and the thing that is touching and flicking and triggering the limiter. So remember when we looked at that limiter and we saw those sharp red spikes going down? That was the kick or the snare triggering the limiter. I like to have my drums a little bit too loud in the mix and then have the limiting be the thing that turns them down. You know, kind of lets me know. So like if I were to set up this mix and say, all right, the drums sound good, you know, I would have it so my drums are barely just hitting my limiter. And then from there, if I tell myself, well, now I've got my drums in a pretty good spot. How do I know if my vocal's loud enough? Don't touch the drums, right? Tell yourself, okay, like I've got my drums set. Like if I'm gonna touch anything, I'm now gonna touch the bass. Like if the bass is too loud or too quiet, don't adjust the drums, just adjust the bass. So when you go at these elements one by one, it's a little bit easier to say, okay, you know, it's sometimes it's distracting to have your hand on so many things, changing so many things at once. It says no, to get the balance of it right, leave one or two things alone and then adjust everything else and sculpt it around it. It really depends on the song. In this song, the drums and the solo are super important. And most mixes you do, the drums and solo are going to be very important. Maybe get those right first and then adjust the volume of the background vocals and say, oh, the background vocals are too loud here. Let me turn up the solo. Don't do that. Turn down the background vocals instead. Decide to leave something alone and work around something else. That'll help you as you go through this. Let's look at the solo chain. So for background vocals, you don't need to process them as heavily. And when I say process them as heavily, you don't need to have this long individual vocal chain for every single vocal. I think these vocals all just have like an EQ on them, and then they all come down to like these buses, right? So like all the mezzos come down to this track right here, which is just EQ. And like, again, this isn't some magic EQ. This might not work for your vocals. My vocals are different than your vocals. And then they go into a multi-band compressor. So multi-band compressors and dynamic EQ, a lot of people are scared of them because they don't know what they do. And when they use the presets, it messes up their audio. Multi-band compressors are extremely useful. Why? Because as someone performs, right, a singer, and they have all these different notes. They're singing just a long sustained ooh here for a whole measure, and then they go to singing this super percussive part, and their part jumps up an octave, and then they start to do a riff. So dynamic processors help with dynamic parts, right? And so sometimes using multi-band compression or dynamic EQ helps you say, okay, you know, I need to get more control out of this area right here. You know, when they go down to that note, think about a bass that goes down to a really low note, right? and they get super, super heavy in their voice. And then they go back up here to this, to this range. Those low notes are going to have a lot more low frequency content. And then the high parts will have less low frequency content. And so if you want it to sound consistent, you need to compress just the low end. So I use a lot of multi-band and dynamic processors because they help me keep things tonally consistent throughout the process. So background vocals come down to this bus right here. Let's see if it play. All right, so what I did is I created a bus for these group vocals. Like all the altos come down to one bus and they all get processed together. All the sopranos are on the same bus. It saves me from adding a compressor and adding an EQ to every individual track. If you don't have a workhorse of a computer, you're gonna crash your computer putting a reverb plugin and a compressor and all this stuff on every single track, right? So, make your life a little bit easier and you'll add a little bit of glue to that. But when you do want to throw the kitchen sink at something, the solo is the place you're probably going to do it. So let's solo out a lot of this stuff that's going on here.
Lights up and they know you are. Do you know you are? Step into the light, so bright sometimes. I'm not ever going back. Step into the light, so bright sometimes. I'm not ever going.
Cool. So here's the vocal dry. When I say dry, I mean that there's no reverb on it. I'm going to turn off a lot of the processing on this vocal. So here's the vocal chain it's going through. All right. Let's turn all of this off and see. Expose this vocal. Here we go.
Step into the light, so bright sometimes. I'm not ever going back. Step into the light.
So if you notice, it already sounds pretty good, right? Let's take a note of that. Like, yeah, it's a little more beefy, but the things I'm doing are not like, whoa, like transformative, right? It sounds different with reverb, obviously, but we're doing a little bit of EQ here. Get rid of some low end, get rid of some low mids, cutting everything above like 18K. This right here is a little bit of noise reduction because it was a little bit noisy in our room. TDR Nova. This is a wonderful plugin. It's free. It's a free dynamic EQ. It's going to control the mids of the voice and a little bit. Some de-essing. This is another compressor, another EQ to cut a little bit more low end because even as we tighten this up, it still stays a little bit beefy in that area. Multi-band compressor to control this high area right here. This is again between 1K and 3.5K and then up to 15K. That area of like 1,000 to 5,000, your vocal should probably dominate that frequency range. Soothe is like a texture thing. It's a dynamic resonance suppressor. I don't want to get into it, but then these are both another de-esser and EQ. So a lot of the time, when you feed a vocal into a compressor, it reacts normally. When you feed just this into a compressor, it's all high frequency content, and it can be very, very harsh. And so for that reason, we really over de-ess, we reduce the sibilance of solo vocals as much as we can. And so here's the before and after.
Step into the light, so bright sometimes.
Before.
I'm not ever going back. Step into the light, so bright sometimes. I'm not ever going back. Step into the light, so bright sometimes.
And if you look really closely, I had to go through and I had to automate this vocal on the way in, right? So I still had to go through and say, all right, like, you know, this vocal, you know, I had to turn up this part, turn down this part. So I get really hands-on with the solo. Like, you'd be surprised how much you're gonna compress this thing. And when it comes down to the reverbs I'm using on this, let's see what's going on here. So both of these reverbs, let's play this.
Step into the light, so bright sometimes. I'm not ever going back. Step into the light.
So there's one reverb on here using a micro delay, you know, 20, 30-second delay, and then an actual delay called Echo Boy. So delays work just as well as reverb. Sometimes they're a little bit cleaner, but this is the EQ I have on the vocal before it hits the delay. I'm cutting everything below, basically below 500 and above 11K. And on this over here, same thing, everything below 300 and everything above, you know, 9K. This goes into a little bit of a delay and then a reverb. Sometimes you can mix up delay and reverb. Sometimes they sound nice blended together. Again, using auxiliary tracks helps you achieve that. So, you know, nothing crazy. If you listen really closely to Harry Styles' song, there's a little bit of like a vocoder effect. And so this right here is a kind of a cooler sound to it. Listen real fast.
Step into the light.
I'm gonna turn it up.
So bright sometimes. I'm not ever going back. Step into the light. So bright sometimes. I'm not ever going back.
So it's really tucked under there. You can't really hear it, but you can feel it. And you can see as I go through the mix, it becomes too much at certain points. When it hits the verse right here. Sorry, that's the bridge. But when it's the verse, I have to turn that down because I really don't like the sound of it. But in the chorus, it kind of needs that beef up. So automation and going through this, and you know, you can't just like set your plugins and be like, all right, well, it should play back perfectly. You're still gonna have to go through and touch up every single one of these moments if you want it to hit the way you're imagining to. So, you know, don't over process the heck out of things. Process them enough and say, okay, the processing is enough at this part, but it's not enough over here. Should I add another processor? Maybe. Or should I automate something? Is that going to get me the result? Because like, does this difference between these two sections happen a lot, right? Maybe I need to go through and do it by hand. So that's the processing for the solo. Real fast, I'll just talk about the bass. We can get a little, well, let's see. There it is. So a lot of the tracks I mix, I use what's called sub bass. This is an octavized version of the bass. Can anyone hear me? No, you can't hear me. I just heard my interface click. That's usually not a good thing. Can you still hear me? Okay, can you hear the mix? Weird. All right, hold on. All bass. There it is. So there's an octavized version of the bass with a lot of high frequency content cut out. Everything literally above 200 hertz is gone. And then there's a copy of the bass that's just compressed and EQ'd. That's it. right? There's nothing crazy going on here. This is just straight up EQ compression, a little bit of saturation, but it's really the name of the game is EQ, and you have to decide, right? Like every time we send a mix to someone, especially like collegiate a cappella groups with this 18 people in the band, they want to hear everything. Everyone wants to hear every single part, and it's not always possible. If you want your song to have a lot of low end to it, you have to make sacrifices, right? Think about all the mixes that you love. You can't hear every single element super, super clear. There needs to be contrast. Some things need to be louder than others. Some things need to sound further away and closer. So, think about like, hey, if I'm going to sacrifice something, what am I going to sacrifice? What's going to be quieter? What's going to be louder? All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right. So it's 6:01 right now. Esme and Nicholas, do you all have any questions? Anything you want us to speak to at all for anyone here in the studio? Nicholas, do you have to go to class today in like an hour?
I actually have one in 2 hours, so I'll be fine.
All right, good. You can get a nap in.
Yeah.
All right, well, so we recorded this class, so hopefully we'll be able to post this somewhere. Might not be public, it might be, we didn't decide yet, but because we don't want to get in trouble for copywriting anyone's music. But if you all have any questions about production, if you're planning projects, if you want to send us mixes, my email is production@cutoffstudios.com. Pretty easy to remember, production@cutoffstudios.com. I'm not gonna do a full one-on-one hour session with you for something, but I can at least give you, a few sentences, paragraphs of feedback. If you ever send a mix to someone, try to send an MP3 and don't send a big wave file, just because, no one can really hear the difference. I mean, some people can, but unless you're listening on like a really nice system, you've got really good ears, but it's easier to click on your phone and listen to. Basically, the files are like a fraction of the size. And you can also send them over email. You don't need to put up like a Google Drive link. But thank you both for showing up, because this is it. If you all have any questions, please reach out. I'm going to pass it back to Emma because I don't really know how to end this.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. For anyone who's not part of Cutoff Studios, would you just pop your name and maybe the group you're representing, if you're representing a group, and where you're calling from, just in the chat, so we have that just for our records, please, before you leave the call. And then you guys are free to go. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight, and hope you learned a lot. Thank you for being here, Esme.
Oh, sorry, Kyle, are you still here?
I am still here. I'm just checking emails. Please, if you got a question, shoot it off.
Oh, so I just saw something in your mixes, and I saw that you have the dry vocal and the reverb like separated into 2 tracks, and I've heard that people like they do this like in a separate way, but is there any reason behind to do this, or like any mechanisms about this?
So what I typically do is I first, when you have your vocal, right? If you need to sit down and you need to kind of clean it up, right? So say, all right, we should EQ it here a little bit. You don't need to go crazy and say this has to be perfect, but you kind of start with what should be done. In most cases, you're going to cut a little bit of like 200, 400, 600 hertz. You're going to compress your vocal. Compression is going to make the volume of your vocals stable. And you like to make sure that it's nice and stable there first. And once you've gotten things like, oh, if I got some noise out of there, I got some low end EQ. Then once it's cleaned up a little bit, when you send that copy, say here's my dry vocal, and I send this copy to my reverb, I know that I'm sending a better version of my solo to the reverb, right? I'm going to use an example of like, let's say there's a lot of like room sound in your vocal, right? Let's say there's a lot of room sound, you've got a lot of like low level noise, like in the vocal, and you've got a lot of EQ problems in the vocal too. If you send that version of your vocal to your reverb, it's going to duplicate those issues, right? If you first take the time to say, all right, I'm going to process my vocal, call it my dry vocal. Like this is like what I recorded, but just like a little compressed and EQ'd. And then I send it to the reverb. I can know that I'm sending a better copy of my own vocal other places. But like we were saying earlier, so the dry vocal is an actual audio track. And then the other one is a bus. It's an auxiliary track, right? It's just a place where that receives audio. It's a track that'll say, hey, I have an input. Like this track of this auxiliary bus has an input to it. And any track in your session can technically be sent there. And like you can send a copy of it there. And so think about like, all right, I've got 100% of my vocal going right out the mix. But then I've got a copy where I'm sending a little bit of volume to this track where I've got a reverb. And I've got a different bus where I'm setting a little bit of volume this way to go to a delay. And so the advantage of the auxiliary buses is that I can cut a lot of low end from that. I'm sending a copy there, but that copy's not going to affect my dry vocal. Those things are going to be added on top of the dry vocal. So like when I sit back and listen to all of this, it's about the sum of those parts. Because I've got my dry vocal, and I've got my vocal with a more low end cut and a little bit of reverb, and my vocal cut low end cut with a little bit of delay on it. But eventually those three things are going to add up again. You need to listen to it and say, okay, which one of these do I need to touch? But sending something to an aux track allows you to basically do whatever you want to the vocal, but just the vocal that's being set to reverb. You can mess around with it however you want, and it won't affect your dry vocal. So it's like the vocal up front, and then a ghostly vocal with reverb on top. You can do whatever you want to that reverb vocal. I know there was a lot of tracks in the session. It was a lot to like look at, but that's like the reality of it, is that sometimes it gets really busy. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you about that. I think I'll start try to get more efficient ways to work on the reverb now.
What DAW are you using?
I'm using Logic Pro.
So the thing that's nice is like everyone uses Logic. So if you have not already, just go to YouTube. You can find literally everything you need to on YouTube. And like because like I'm using Pro Tools. I can't tell you exactly how to set up a bus like that and how to do it. But if you go to YouTube, you're going to find in a matter of 20 seconds, someone who will tell you how to do that in a matter of just a couple of clicks in your session. Yeah.
There's one final question, and it's sort of
Sure.
hypothetical right now because I still haven't really seen this as a problem yet, but because just as like what I typed in the chat, because I'm the singer for all the parts of the song, so how do I say this? The timbre and the frequencies, they're going to sound very similar. So
yep.
Is there?
So there's not really a way around that. Like, so there are other mixes of like certain bands, right? Like the classic band that's one of the ones that I think of is like there's a band called Mariana's Trench, and their lead singer, who's a phenomenal singer, he has tracks where he's recorded every single part, like 12 different parts, and like it all has that same timbre to it. When you stack your voice, your specific voice, Nicholas, 20 times, it's going to sound a certain way. My advice to you, try to EQ them differently, right? Don't like for if you have a baritone part, do a totally different EQ cut than the tenors get, right? And the soprano part, if you're singing that high, should get a different EQ cut. And you can do different things to them to give them different textures, right? Maybe you want to give the tenor part a slightly different reverb than the baritone part, but like it makes your job harder for sure. Like your voice has the same timbre no matter what you sing, pretty much, unless you really, really go 180. But listen, like I've done like demos, right? People ask you to record an arrangement where I've sang every part and it sounds weird. Like there's no way around it. Even doesn't matter unless you have like just honestly like some super incredible voice, which like most people really don't, you know, unless you can like really change the timbre of your voice from part to part, it's gonna sound a little weird, you know. So you know, my advice to you is find some friends who you want to record. That will make your life the easiest. If you're like, man, I just can't get the soprano part to sound like I wanted to, like find someone to sing it. That way it sounds different, because you'll be like, oh, that was a lot easier than, I don't know, trying to solve it in mixing. Yeah. Yep. But that's the
Just
place
for
you
the
start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try getting that around because I don't think that'll be easy, but
Or you can try
uh,
reaching out to people online. Like reach out to people online and say, hey, can someone sing the soprano part and record it and get it back to me? You'd be surprised. You know?
I've actually never thought about this because originally I meant it to be like just a one-man project. It's just a little bit of fun for me to see, but yeah, I
Listen,
think
it's
reaching out
you
to
know,
people.
and historically what I would tell you is like, don't sit on projects for too long. If you like the way something sounds and it sounds good, you know, release it, put it out, and say, you know what, this is the project. This is, you know, I did all the work that I wanted to do on it. Now I'm done with this project. I'm going to move on to a new project, and I'm going to learn from that project, and that project's going to be better. You're going to be a lot happier with yourself if you finish a project faster and then move on to a new project and say, you know what, that project, it's not going to be as good as my next one because I didn't do X, Y, and Z, but now I'm going to do that on the next project. And that's it's just such a better mindset versus you saying like, oh, of course, at 3 months, I'm going to find all these singers. It's like, you know, so like put your project out, say, I did it, and then say, I'm going to move on to a new one and get better, because you'll have a better time. And as you go through this, you're going to learn every single time you do something. Every single mix, every single project, you'll say, well, I'm never going to do that again, you know, or you'll learn. You just learn from your mistakes, really.